This is the lecture on motivation and practice for psychological foundations of musical behavior. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about those things. The book does a pretty good job of talking about them, so this may be a short little lecture, although sometimes when I say that, we then have a lengthy lecture. So we shall see. So first, we're going to talk about motivation and practice kind of go hand in hand because the action of practicing has to be motivated by something, either within the musician or externally, and we'll talk about that just a little bit later. But we're first going to talk about are there indications in early childhood of those that are going to become stronger musicians? And people have actually studied this, and what they find is that really people that go on to become musicians, even prodigies, their really early childhood is not significantly different than others. There's not normally any indication that they are more musical in preschool. They have found that some of these people that are people that grow up to be highly musical, that they often are able to sing recognizable songs earlier than others, about 6 months earlier. But that's that's kind of a little, fuzzy finding, I think. One of the big things that they do notice when looking at the biographies of people that have gone on to be very successful in music or highly achieve in music is that they have higher parental involvement than those that don't pursue music. Let's see. Sorry, my notes are a little bit all over the place. Yeah, so those studies was really looking at, this was Sloboda and Davidson's 1996 study that had those findings, and they really did it through musical biographies and interviews, and then musical diaries that the parents and the children kept. So when thinking about motivation for Roxy, sorry, my dog has got something. So, sorry about that. So when looking at motivation for, there are two types of motivation that we normally look at. We look at intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And these are very straightforward. They discuss them in the book. Intrinsic is really coming from within, that there is, it's from the joy of practicing, it's from the feeling of satisfaction of attaining a goal, whereas extrinsic is anything external, and that is a lot of things. That could be, your parents' affection, that could be applause, that could be, if you have some sort of monetary reward for winning a competition, all the being the best at school, like that's actually extrinsic. It feels like that might be intrinsic because you want to be the best, but that's extrinsic because it's in relationship to other people. It's not just that you want to accomplish it. So in intrinsic motivation, especially for early childhood or younger musicians, their interaction with music should be playful and have an active engagement, as opposed to being, directed in exactly how to do it. A lot of very accomplished musicians, they always talk about having some sort of peak experience where they remember something very specific that made music meaningful to them personally, and that's part of, kind of their foundation of intrinsic motivation. A lot of times intrinsic motivation is seen in informal music making. You see this especially in popular musicians, where they informally get together and jam out. They have fun playing their music together. And last, one of the things about intrinsic motivation is this idea of freedom and choice. In the book, it touches on this, but by giving just a little bit of freedom to students, they feel like they have ownership of their own playing, and so that's a way to keep them more engaged and more motivated. Extrinsic, like I said before, a lot of times parents are a source of extrinsic motivation. In the book, they do a nice job of talking about there's this fine line of parents of being engaged or kind of watching and just taking note of how musical progress is happening versus being hovering and being a helicopter parent. There's a very fine line between supporting the student versus kind of controlling them. And so the research shows that parents that just check on the progress and that are advocates for their children and they ask advice of the teacher, that's the kind of support that they need more so than, I'm going to sit and watch you practice every day for an hour. And also if parents can help provide information to the teacher, that's another good resource for the child's musical development. In the book, it does a nice job talking about teachers and kind of the different dispositions that help create positive attitudes towards music. It's maybe a little counterintuitive that for especially young or new students in music, they really need someone that is warm and personable and gets them excited about music. It's more about helping create a rapport, and a rapport not only with the teacher but with the discipline of music itself. And then as they get older and they are developing as a musician, then there needs to be someone that has a little more expertise to really help the student develop. And that's where the student themselves may want someone that's a more accomplished performer than who they start with. And you may think about your own experiences. I mean, piano was my principal instrument, and that transition was exactly, now that I think about it. So I had a very kind and warm piano teacher until I was in mid-high school, and I went to a piano camp. And at the piano camp, one of the instructors suggested that maybe my piano teacher wasn't challenging me enough. And so I then went and actually got a new piano teacher, which is kind of heartbreaking in some ways because I was in the middle of high school, and I'm sure my piano teacher wanted to see me through high school. But it was definitely for those reasons, because my new piano teacher, it was all about, okay, let's get ready for your college audition and let's work on these skills. And I was deficient in some skills. A lot of my technique was not as strong as it probably should have been. And so, so I definitely see that in my own experience. So you might look back and, look at the dispositions of your private teachers. Teachers also should help students learn how to practice, because they assume that, I think a lot of teachers don't do enough to explain how to practice well. And we're going to talk about practice in just a little bit. So the other extrinsic motivation is peers. And, it probably seems really intuitive that kids will want to participate in things that are considered cool or that might give them social standing. And whether music does that or not, that's probably up for a debate. But I'm pretty involved in some research that's looking at why students stay in music ensembles or not. And peers are definitely students are definitely very influenced by what elective choices their friends make, and so especially in music. And so that's really something that can motivate students into music or even away from music. Also, when looking at peers, there's also competition, and competition is it's a complex phenomenon, and it discusses a little bit that in the book, that in some ways it really propels students to achieve higher, to really get the best performance they can. But it also creates anxiety in some people. It creates, maybe, it emphasizes things that are not necessarily the most important, such as it's not emphasizing learning the right skills to be able to play this repertoire. It's just, I would just need to be the best. And so, competition, and it's weird because different spheres of musical experience have kind of different levels of competition. Like in choir world, competition isn't really such a big thing, except for, the obvious things like for solos or for all-state or for that sort of thing. But band world, it seems much more embedded within the culture itself. A lot of bands, they seat their students by their chairs, and so chair 1 is better than chair 2 and chair 3. And marching bands, there's this very hierarchical structure where you've got section leaders, and you've got the drum major, and you've got like all these different roles and things like that. So, it can be a lot for a student. In addition to extrinsic and extrinsic, as far as like those are types of motivation, but the book talks about different beliefs students might have or musicians might have that influence their motivation. The book talks about self-efficacy, and they talk about McPherson and McCormick's study in 1999. And I just want to, for a second, really clarify what self-efficacy is. So self-efficacy is how well a person thinks they can do a specific task. So, for instance, in the McPherson-McCormick study, they were asking, they were piano students that were about to do their performance and test. I think that this is in Australia, in the British system, where, when you get to a certain A level, you take these tests and examinations at the end of the year. And so all they did was they asked them, how confident they were that they were going to do well on this test. So it was very specific. It wasn't even like, how strong a musician do you think you are, or that sort of thing. It was really, how well do you think you're going to do on the specific test right now? And what they found is those that believed that they were going to do well, they had high self-efficacy, they did well. So in some ways, the finding isn't super surprising, because a lot of that seems kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy. If students thought that they weren't going to do well on it, and then they didn't do well, then, they fulfilled their prophecy. And, in situations like that, to see yourself as an underdog is kind of psychologically more, it's less taxing, because if you see yourself as not going to do well and then you do well, then you're like, oh, I'm a lot better than I thought I was. But if you think you're going to do well and then you don't do well, then that's very psychologically harmful, or taxing, as I said before. So that's self-efficacy. And some of the research the research I was just talking about peers, we were really looking at self-concept, and that's something that a lot of researchers are looking at now, as far as how do we develop a music self-concept. And by self-concept, we're talking about how, when we talk about music self-concept, another way to phrase it is, how strong of a musician do they think they are? So not specifically about performing on their primary instrument, just in general, do they think of themselves as a musical person? And what we're finding in our research, which is really very interesting, is students that think that they are a strong musician, that they are much more likely to go on in music than those who don't. I mean, and that kind of sounds like, well, of course. But what that says to me as a music educator is that students are getting messages that they aren't a good musician from somewhere, and that is pushing them out of music. And so that's something we have to really look at as a researchers within the field. We need to look at how those messages are being sent to kids and what it's really doing. How does that really impact their future decisions? Kids are very receptive, and so maybe as boys' voices are changing, they're having trouble matching pitch, and a teacher meaning very well because they want to have a great performance tells them to mouth their words at a concert. That really has devastating effects for their future participation and their feeling as a musician for the rest of their life. So we really have to be really cognizant of how we can help build our students' musical self-concept. That study that I was talking about, we actually were looking at singing accuracy to see if singing accuracy if self-concept predicts singing accuracy. And what we found is that students that thought they were better musicians were better singers. And so we don't know the causal connection. We don't know if, they feel like they're better musicians and so they feel better about trying to sing and trying to match pitch. And so that's what's doing. So that's why there's this relationship. It's probably more likely the other way around, where students that are told that they aren't strong singers or they feel like they have difficulty in singing, then they really don't see themselves as a good musician, which we should really care about that, especially those of you in instrumental areas, that if there's this relationship there, then you might be losing players in your band because they think they're poor singers and that therefore they're bad musicians. So it's all connected. In the book, it talks a little bit about attribution theory, which is how people look at challenges. If they fail or succeed, is it based on ability, on effort, on luck, or difficulty? And the research that was mentioned in the book, it shows that, and this is a cultural thing, something that we need to look more closely at, but as students get older, they attribute success in music being that is responsible because of ability, that people are just naturally better. And as we learned from when we look at the practice literature, we know that's not true. We know that it's the people that are better are the people that have practiced more. That's not anything surprising at all. So that's another thing music educators need to do, is we need to help dispel this idea that being musical is genetic or purely genetic. And we really have this, like people don't see themselves as musical at all. And we really need to help spread the word that everyone is musical, just to varying degrees. So now let's talk a little bit about practice. So when we're talking about practice, we're talking about quantity and we're talking about quality. And in the text, it really kind of talks about, the 10-year rule, where if you work on a skill for 10 years, by that end of that 10 years, you're essentially an expert. And there seems to be a lot of documentation that supports that. The other big idea is that 10,000 hours of practice helps you get to become an expert, and I do think there's some truth to that. But especially in music, I think the quality of the practice is also important. People that start practicing their instrument early in life, they do get a head start. So they have gains in achievement that people that's, if someone starts at age 4 versus age 9, that person at age 4 is going to, have advantages up to a point. Once they enter the professional field, though, over time, those advantages really go away, right? I mean, that's just, that makes sense. And these researchers that look at 10,000 words, 10,000 hours, it really is about accumulated practice. It's not that you can shortcut. So, for instance, the child prodigies. It's not that they got a shortcut because they started early. It's just they put in more time earlier in their life, and that's how they're ahead of the pack. But yeah, I mean, there's some pretty strong evidence, about putting the time in helps create musical achievement, and that was the Erickson study that's mentioned in the text. Very strong relationship between deliberate practice and achievement. But even though those studies really trying to suggest that it's all about amount, we do know that quality does matter, and it may matter just as much as amount. The first thing to talk about when talking about the quality of practice is deliberate versus informal practice. Deliberate practice is goal-oriented, meaning you're trying to get meaningful feedback on your skills. Opportunities for repetition and correction of errors, requires effort and concentration. This type of practice is effective when there are goals, especially if they're intrinsic goals versus extrinsic as far as trying to accomplish something. This also involves, like I said, feedback where you hear and you get knowledge of results, you know what you're going for. And it's also an extension of previous skills. You're building on something as opposed to trying to do something new. So deliberate practice is very different than informal practicing, which, a lot of times we think about informal practice being, the garage band getting together, which is true, but it could also be, fiddling around in the practice room on your instrument when you're not working on your literature. And it's playful, it's intrinsically motivated, it's enjoyment-oriented, it helps maintain motivation, and also promotes expressivity. And in the book, they also talk about how informal practicing with others helps with flexibility and communication among other musicians. So even though informal practice may not always be on task, there could be a lot of things that really benefit the student that is engaged in an informal practice. So distributed practice versus mass practice, this is really straightforward. Mass practice is practicing at long sessions on focused material. Distributed practice, that's sessions distributed over time, having shorter rehearsals over the day as opposed to 1 4-hour block of rehearsing. Another type of practice that I don't think is mentioned in the book is variable practice, and that's doing things like trying different tempi or articulations. I remember I was always told to practice Bach, dotting, kind of swinging it, just so that you have a little different, a little different style with it that kind of keeps it fresh as you're practicing it. Some people, they do random practice where they practice blocks, kind of different parts of a piece in order, and some research has shown that actually helps build skills more quickly as opposed to repetition, because it has something to do with the neural network. I don't really know off the top of my head or remember exactly the details of that, but I do know that I have heard that random practice is shown to have some benefits. And that kind of goes with looking at part versus whole. And they looked at the Mishra study in the text where they had those 4 different types: serial, segmented, additive, and holistic. It seems that the author suggested that there were different benefits for different types of practice. The book also talks about mental practice as being a form of practice, and I don't know if you engaged in this as much as I did, but so there are different types of mental practice. In the book it talks about score study, which we should probably all do more score study than we do, but also just thinking through things, or fingering them without phonating, or blowing into the horn. The research seems to show that maybe some combination of mental and physical is best. That it helps, that it does enhance the physical practice. It also allows the musician to rest their body, or their voice, or whatever that's involved in the rehearsal process. Not also just physiologically, but also neurologically. You're not having to engage that part of the brain quite as difficult or as intensely as performing the task itself. Mental practice can improve motor performance, but it requires a level of technical understanding to be effective. Meaning, like if if I look at a piece of music that I haven't started playing, and I try to envision myself playing it, it's really not going to be helpful if I don't know how that's going to fit in my hands. Also, studies have shown that listening to previously played pieces, it activates the motor areas in the brain that would be used to perform that. When I was in undergrad and I was getting ready for my senior recital, for my solo piano performances, I kind of was a lot more anxious than other types of performances, conducting or singing in choirs. And so my private teacher really encouraged me to do a lot of mental practice. And it was really great because it showed me exactly where my memory slips were. I would literally sit down and just think through the entire program, and I really think that helped me have a strong recital. So yeah, I am definitely. I wish I did more mental practice now. I don't have enough time to do physical practice now, but yeah, I wish I engaged more of it. One thing about practicing that, or kind of something that has come on the horizon about practicing, is this idea of consolidation, and sleep consolidation. And what this is that it's this idea that sleep actually helps the brain make the neural networks that you were just working on in your technical practice. So this is all coming from Bob Duke at the University of Texas, and what his research is finding is that people that work on a technical skill, like let's say they were working on fingerings on the piano, and then if they go to sleep and they test them the next day, that there are no decrements. They are able to do them just as fast as they were able to do the day before. But if they do it at the beginning of the day, and then 12 hours later without sleeping, they come and do it, they actually are slower. And then if they come back the next morning, they're even slower. So what they suggest, or what the research is kind of positing now, is that if you don't sleep pretty much after this, after you're working on something very motor oriented, getting your fingers to do a certain pattern or something like that, that all the other motor things you do throughout the day interfere with that work that you did. And so if you work on something pretty close before you go to sleep, and the next day it's already like those neural pathways have been strengthened, and you can build on it from there. We're still at the early stages of that, but it's pretty intriguing information. You can have your students practice it. Excuse me. You could tell them to, try, for a week, practice for 20 minutes right before going to bed and see if it gets any better, if their skills are developing, as opposed to 20 minutes before school. Right? Who knows? Can you have too much practice? Of course you can. And too much practice can cause injuries through repetitive stress. If you are playing a loud instrument in a small practice room, it can cause hearing loss. It also can cause vocal dystonia, which is a loss of motor control. I think that's what Schumann got. Like, I don't know. Do you remember that story from music history where he created some device to try to play things faster, and through that he actually lost control, motor control. It's kind of a sad story. And that's it. That is our chat on practice and motivation. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.